History remembers Sultan Ibrahim I, not with reverence, but with dread. His name is whispered as a warning, a ruler whose paranoia and excess nearly destroyed an empire. The legends are chilling: a harem drowned, a son scarred, a court ruled by terror. But to understand Ibrahim, we must look beyond the monster and see the system that made him. He spent over 20 years locked in the cafes, the cage of Topkapi Palace, a gilded prison for royal heirs. Every day he lived in fear, watching his brothers executed, never knowing if he'd be next. When the throne finally became his, he emerged not as a triumphant prince, but as a broken man. Dragged from the cage, terrified and unprepared, Ibrahim was a survivor of relentless psychological torment. His reign was haunted by the trauma of isolation and helplessness. The damage shaped every decision, every outburst, every act of supposed madness. Ibrahim's story is not just about a mad king. It's about what happens when a brutal system hands absolute power to a shattered soul. The line between man and monster blurs in the shadows of the palace. To judge him, we must first understand the world that caged him. This is the tragedy of Sultan Ibrahim, a legacy forged in fear and unleashed upon an empire. The most infamous tale is the drowning of Ibrahim's harem, hundreds of women, condemned by a single whisper of betrayal. The story is horrifying, but it's just one of many: a son's face slashed in a jealous rage, a court scandalized by his obsessions. Ibrahim's appetites became legend: his search for the largest woman in the empire, his chambers thick with the scent of ambergris. These stories, true or not, painted him as a ruler, lost to violent whims and bizarre desires. They served his enemies well, creating a narrative of a dangerous lunatic on the throne. The drowned harem, the scarred son, the excesses, they became weapons, justifying his removal. But behind every legend is a purpose to turn a flawed ruler into a monster. The truth is tangled in myth, but the damage to his reputation was real. Ibrahim's legacy was shaped as much by rumor as by reality. In the end, the stories made him easier to destroy. And the empire, desperate for stability, was ready to believe them. Topkapi Palace was a world of beauty and danger, a city within a city, ruled by ceremony and intrigue. The Sultan was both master and prisoner, watched by rivals and surrounded by plots. The harem was a political powerhouse, led by the Valida Sultan, where women shaped the future of the empire. For princes like Ibrahim, the cafes was a gilded cage, luxurious but suffocating. Brothers were kept under guard, denied any role in government, living in constant fear of execution. The cage was meant to prevent civil war, but it bred paranoia and trauma. Princes emerged from years of isolation unprepared for rule, haunted by fear and suspicion. When Ibrahim was told he would be sultan, he barricaded himself in terror, convinced it was a trap. Only the sight of his brother's corpse convinced him he was safe. This was the man expected to lead an empire. Traumatized, inexperienced, and deeply scarred, the palace that produced sultans also destroyed them. Ibrahim's reign was shaped by the very walls that were meant to protect him. In Topkapi, power and fear were inseparable. The system that caged him would ultimately doom his rule. The empire's heart was also its greatest danger. Strip away the legends, and the historical record reveals a more complex Ibrahim. The drowned harem appears in only one source. Other chroniclers are silent. The scarred prince? The wound was real, but the story behind it is murky. Perhaps an accident, perhaps political slander. What's clear is that Ibrahim's reign was marked by extravagance and mismanagement. He lavished money on favorites, taxed provinces for luxuries, and appointed unqualified officials at the whim of his mother and concubines. The court became a marketplace for influence, run by the women of the harem. Corruption and incompetence flourished, weakening the state and angering the elite. The most lurid tales may be myth, but the dysfunction was real. Ibrahim was damaged by his years in the cage, easily manipulated and unfit for the throne. His reign's true tragedy was not monstrous evil, but disastrous weakness. The myth is sensational, but the reality is no less damning. The empire paid the price for a broken ruler. Was Ibrahim truly mad, or was he a desperate survivor? His trauma from the cage likely caused severe anxiety and paranoia, symptoms we'd recognize today as mental illness. But some actions were calculated. He tried to build his own power base, resisting his mother's control and exiling her from the palace. These were clumsy but deliberate moves to assert authority. Ibrahim's paranoia was not unfounded. He was surrounded by enemies. His erratic behavior was both illness and strategy, a mix of brokenness and survival instinct. The line between madness and political maneuvering blurred in the palace. His tragedy was that his real trauma became the perfect excuse for his enemies. Every act, rational or not, was twisted into proof of insanity. In the end, he was a man lost in a world of sharks, his illness weaponized against him. In Ottoman politics, madness was the deadliest accusation. To call the Sultan insane was to challenge his right to rule, uniting military, clergy, and bureaucrats against him. Ibrahim's enemies seized on every eccentricity, every excess, and spun them into a narrative of lunacy. The Grand Mufti's fatwa made rebellion a righteous act, not treason. The janissaries and viziers, threatened by his erratic rule and costly wars, used the charge of madness to justify their coup. The truth mattered less than the story they told. By isolating and undermining him, they pushed Ibrahim further into paranoia, creating more evidence of his instability. The accusation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was a masterstroke of political narrative and a personal tragedy. Ibrahim's real weaknesses were exploited, his image destroyed. In the end, the story of madness was the sharpest weapon of all. It cut down a sultan and changed the empire forever. Ibrahim's 8-year reign left the empire wounded. His reckless spending and obsession with luxury drained the treasury, forcing new taxes and sparking unrest. Corruption flourished as offices were sold to favorites, eroding the state's ability to govern and wage war. The Cretan War, launched on a whim, became a costly, endless conflict that bled the empire for decades. The prestige of the Sultanate suffered most. Ibrahim's deposition and execution shattered the aura of invincibility. The palace became a battleground for factions, and the monarchy's mystique was forever weakened. His rule set a precedent. Sultans could be overthrown by their own officials. The chaos and instability that followed haunted the empire for generations. Ibrahim's legacy was not just personal failure, but institutional damage. The scars of his reign ran deep, reshaping Ottoman politics. The mad sultan's downfall was a warning. Unchecked power and broken men can destroy even the greatest empires. The cost of his rule was paid by all. By 1648, the Ottoman elite had had enough. War, corruption, and Ibrahim's erratic rule united his enemies. A failed plot against the janissaries was the final straw. The Grand Vizier, Grand Mufti, and janissary leaders moved quickly. The janissaries stormed the palace. The Grand Mufti's fatwa declared Ibrahim unfit to rule. His 7-year-old son was made sultan. Ibrahim was thrown back into the cage. For 10 days, he languished, powerless and alone. Fearing a restoration, the new regime secured a second fatwa for his execution. On August 18, 1648, the chief executioner ended his life with a bowstring. The reign of Ibrahim the Mad was over, ended by the same system that had created him. His death was swift, brutal, and final. The empire moved on, but the scars remained. Ibrahim's tragedy was complete, a life defined by fear, power, and betrayal. History is written by the victors, and Ibrahim's legacy was shaped by those who destroyed him. To justify their coup, they painted him as a monster. His flaws magnified, his humanity erased. The label of madness became a convenient shorthand, turning a complex man into a cautionary tale. We remember the caricature, not the person, the broken soul shaped by fear and isolation. His story warns of the dangers of absolute power, but also of the systems that create instability. Ibrahim's voice was lost. Only his enemies' stories remain. To find the real man, we must question the myths and consider the trauma of his upbringing. His reign was a disaster, but his life was a tragedy long before he wore the crown. Ibrahim's story is a disturbing look at power, trauma, and the politics of memory. It reminds us that history is rarely simple. Sometimes it's the story of the broken and the lost, not just heroes and villains. The Mad Sultan's legacy is a mirror, reflecting the darkness of his world and ours. In the end, he was both victim and villain, shaped by forces far greater than himself.